welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Mike Wall, Executive Director of Automotive Analysis at S&P Global Mobility. In today's episode of Fuel for Thought, we'll be discussing the future of trucking. Disruption is coming to the medium and heavy commercial vehicle industry. An increased focus on climate change, strict regulations, and technological innovations are expected to change the future of this industry. I'm pleased to be joined by Andrej Divis, Executive Director of Global Heavy Truck Research, and Greg Genette, Senior Research Analyst for Heavy Truck Markets. So let's get started. First things first, let's set the stage a bit and discuss some recent commercial vehicle performance and maybe the near-term outlook. And Andrej, why don't we start with you? How are things shaping up right now? And maybe, both on the commercial vehicle front, but what are some of maybe the big themes that are prevalent in the market right now?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mike. Great to be here. In terms of themes that are prevalent in the market right now, one thing is everybody's looking at industry volume in 2024 globally. We're forecasting it's going to be kind of a sideways year. Of course, there's a lot of variation at the regional level and a lot of questions that are individual to the regions. In Europe, of course, we've seen some geopolitical tensions, and we're also seeing some countries struggle with recession or near recession. And that's raising a lot of questions. And when we turn to Asia, where some of the biggest truck markets in the world are, including China and India, we've got different situations there. In India, of course, it's an election year. The market's been coming back. How much momentum is there going to be? And when we look at China, China's come off of a period of boom years during early COVID. Now the economy's reopened. We've had an emission change there. The market softened a bit, but it's been rebounding. So the question is, how fast can that go? And of course, how is all of that going to trend into the future over the next couple of years? The other big question is all around the energy transition. And again, the specific problems and the specific questions vary by region.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see, it is amazing to see it. You see some very similar trends to the light vehicle market, but obviously some also very unique characteristics to this as well. Greg, when you think about, studying the North American market and the U.S. market for commercial vehicles, what are some of the noteworthy trends you're seeing impacting the market, again, within the broader North American region?
Yeah. Hi, Mike, and hi, Andre. Thanks for having me. I think there's a few main topics we can hit on for North America. Of course, we have to start with the regulatory roadmap, because again, it is election year here as well in the U.S. So we do have new NOx and pollution standards starting in model year 2027. And without getting too much into the details, really what that could impact the market is we could have higher costs for ICE and diesel trucks, which could really change the market fundamentals, especially as we ramp up, let's say in 2025, 2026, in that sort of pre-buy, low-buy scenario. The other piece of the puzzle here is new greenhouse gas emission regulations. And we've had a proposal on the table for quite some time now, and we are expecting a finalized GHG regulations in the coming months, maybe even weeks here. And the impact here is really going to be pushing truck manufacturers to reduce the emissions and ultimately improve the fuel efficiency of their trucks. So really one big bucket we're looking at is the regulatory environment. There's a lot of moving parts, and to add that layer of complexity as we look into the election is just, brings things even more complex. The other bucket I want to kind of talk about is the products rollout. I think if we were talking maybe 12, 24, 36 months ago, product availability in terms of BEVs and fuel cells might be a challenge, but I think we've the industry's done a good job. A lot of the major manufacturers have launched some products in this area in terms of the regulatory, the battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. And what I think is, a trend that we're looking at moving forward is, are these product launches going to be met with the supporting network, say the infrastructure, any subsidies or incentives, et cetera, things like that. And the last trend for North America really surrounding the energy transition is, in forums like this, I like to a little bit compare it to the light vehicle market as you did, Mike, just because I think the trucking market is so unique. And a trend that we're seeing right now and as we head into the midterm and even long term is that what we're calling sometimes a dual ZEV strategy. So a lot of the major manufacturers are looking at hydrogen as a solution to decarbonize, but also obviously a battery electric truck. So, as we look at the regulations, product rollout, and all these different technologies, there's a lot of exciting and noteworthy things happening in the North America market right now.
Yeah, you bring up some great points, and boy, the number of cross currents that are impacting us
Yeah.
here in North America and indeed globally are profound. And I guess, Andre, turning to you, I know similar to the light vehicle market as we've kind of discussed, there are the commercial vehicle market's facing just a number of different call it pressures, call it factors and influences, whether it be the focus on climate change, emissions, regulations, and there's so many others. I know we've been doing a lot of work on taking a scenarios-based approach to assessing the industry. Can you take a minute, maybe explain what we've been doing on that front?
Sure, and thanks for the question. So, as Greg already alluded to, we're doing quite a lot of work on the short and medium term in our regular forecast services. But given the scale of the transition facing the industry, as well as the timeline to achieving some of the climate goals and some of the OEM goals, um, for a number of years now, we've been taking a long term view of the industry out to 2050 as well. And in fact, we just released an update of that study called "Reinventing the Truck 2023," which we released in November with our latest view. And this study is, as you said, built around scenarios, and the reason it's built around scenarios is quite simple. It's because there are so many unknowns. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to paint a picture of a couple possible futures for our customers, um, so that they can use that to inform their planning processes for however long they need. And the scenarios are really built around a couple basic differences, but in summary, our baseline, it's called the inflection scenario. It reflects a world where the future is contested, the future is uncertain. Um, it's actually an extension of our current baseline, um, and it's a little more conservative than our other scenario, which is called the green rules scenario. And the green rules scenario, that describes a world in which we really see uh, progress on the technological front, significant cost reduction around zero emission technologies, and importantly, a lot of political will and alignment of political will in all of the major markets to make the changes happen, put money behind it, to put the regulations in place that are needed to achieve those targets. Um, and one thing that we've spent a lot of time on in the 23 study in particular is also identifying what we're calling signposts that our customers can use over the next few years as time progresses to assess which track we're on. Um, so that's a little bit about the scenarios that we.
That's great. I mean, I'm mindful of the fact that this is such a complex industry that you almost have to take a scenarios-based approach because any particular variable can change, and how that change reverberates through the system and maybe has a feedback flow and impact on other variables is fascinating. It's also interesting to hear about those signposts too, to help folks navigate even further as we get down through each different route or path, as it were. And Greg, maybe turning back to you, you brought up some really interesting aspects on the electrified vehicle front during when we were talking about North America and the U.S. market. So let's dig into that maybe a little bit further, because obviously, even to a layperson, we see a lot of electrification going on, or certainly a lot of talk about it, a lot of deployment in various stages. So as you think about it, and as you maybe hear different stories about changing EV sentiment among the automakers and consumers in both the light vehicle market and the medium and heavy market, frankly, for that matter. What are you seeing on that front, on that commercial vehicle space? Is it similar? Is it different? How is that transpiring? And maybe as another secondary question to that, what are some of the high level trends that folks can think about and maybe answer to help answer that broader question about vehicle electrification and the commercial vehicle side?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I think to start, right, we want to say it's definitely at the earlier stages if we compare it to a light vehicle, right, where we're not nearly close to the percentages that they're seeing in terms of, let's say, new sales or fleet. So it's in the early stages, and I think obviously there's some obvious reasons for that, such as the work that trucks are required to do, obviously their size and things like that. But if I had to summarize sort of the time we're in at the moment, I think it's tough, right? I think the industry is navigating sort of a landscape that's changing. And what do I mean by that? I think Andre, was a good transition to this question because I think signposts, as we talk about, there's a lot continuing to merge in both directions, right? The demand and performance maybe has been a bit lower than we expected, maybe 24, 36 months ago, but some of those signposts, like I said, are moving in both directions. On one hand, some of the positives, we're really seeing strong partnerships, something that the industry hasn't really seen in a while, right? I'll just give one brief example. We've had a landmark a battery supply partnership between Packard, Daimler, and Accelera by Cummins. So that just gives an example, like these, they're making progress in partnering, which is definitely a positive signpost. Product availability, I touched on that earlier. I think it's going in the right direction. The regulatory environment is another signpost as ICs get regulated further. It's definitely a signpost to further adoption of electrification. And then obviously OEM investments and trends and things like that we're looking at is that all of these OEMs are investing in a lot of different things. When I talk about a dual ZEV strategy, we're talking about hydrogen, battery electric trucks, hydrogen ICE. So really, there's been a lot of bets placed, and we'll see, where that comes out. But then, yeah, at the flip side, like I said, it's a tough environment right now. I think we're kind of gaining our foot, but some of the maybe not so positives, the infrastructure remains a challenge, not necessarily the amount, but also the time and the permitting it takes, the grid. These trucks are very large, so it's going to take a big undertaking as well there. And then really high costs, right? These, I think we'll talk about it a little later potentially, but costs really affect this industry. It's sometimes a low margin industry that in order to change things, you really need a good cost that could provide some ROI. So I think and then to answer your next question, some of the trends, I think really where we are today, there still needs to be a lot figured out. But we're definitely better off than maybe we were a couple of years ago. And for those who are maybe more familiar with the light vehicle market, I think in terms of penetration or sales share, we'll always be a bit behind. But I think the industry is still looking to decarbonize and looking to add those new technologies as we move forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because it does feel like the activity is picking up in the commercial vehicle space. It does feel like it lags a bit, certainly the light vehicle space, but it is feel like it is picking up. And I guess a bonus question for you, just to kind of follow on that, because you brought up a good point about sort of that dual path approach somewhat between EV and fuel cell, because that's not something that we see in the light vehicle market nearly as much.
Right.
Is that also delineated maybe by weight class, or are you seeing other maybe nuances within the broader commercial vehicle segment?
Right. Yeah. Great point. So definitely on weight class, but also the end vocation. Like what is the truck doing? Right. We have a lot of let's say regional or port trucks that are making maybe 150, 200-mile round trips a day, maybe a bit less than that. That would be great for electrification, right? They can go back to their home base or their warehouse, charge overnight, or whatever the case may be, and use it the next day. So it depends on the weight class and the vocation. And then for hydrogen, all else equal, the positives for hydrogen compared to battery electric are obviously the range, the refueling time, maybe the payload in terms of how heavy the technology is. You don't have that big battery. So those are some of the positives. And then if we look at that, we can look at vocations just a bit longer haul routes compared to what I just described before. So anything that's a bit longer than 150 or so miles would be good. And then also we think about work trucks, right? So if you have, I know Andrej and I have talked about this example. If you have a work truck that's, maybe a snow plow, it's going to be a lot harder to keep that battery charged. If you're removing some snow from the local neighborhood. So that's the kind of thing we look at is vocation, weight class, and then the backdrop to that is the OEM side is like what are they investing in? We know a lot of OEMs are looking at both as well because they sell into both markets, right? Lower weight class, different vocations, and things like that.
Those are great points, great points. And just building on that, Greg mentioned a little bit about the cost equations and some of that. We hear a lot about when we talk about the commercial vehicle market, total cost of ownership. Can you explain maybe what exactly total cost of ownership is, sort of in the context of commercial vehicles and why it's important? And what does our research on that subject really tell us?
Sure. So the reason total cost of ownership comes up, the primary reason is because trucks are tools. They're not discretionary purchases. They're not emotional items. They have a job to do. And as Greg mentioned, there's got to be an ROI on them. And the primary means by which fleet managers assess trucks is in terms of total cost of ownership. And those are the metrics that they look at to make decisions often between buying one truck versus another truck. And it's one of the biggest variables also feeding into our forecasts and our outlooks on the energy transition. Of course, there's others. As we already mentioned, the regulations play a very heavy role here. OEM strategy plays a heavy role. But for sure, total cost of ownership is a very important variable. Within reinventing the truck, and actually in the background to reinventing the truck, we have produced a full set of cost of ownership models for all the major regions around the world. And those cost of ownership models are specific to different weight classes, different vocations, and taking into account a wide range of variables. Of course, product cost is one. Of course, fuel is another. But things that we're also looking at are going to be maintenance and repair, residual value, and even the cost of the driver. In our study, we report cost of ownership as a lump sum, but commonly it can be expressed that way or in terms of cents per mile or a number of other ways, but it really all boils down to the same thing. What is the total cost, for lack of a better term, to operate this vehicle to do the job that I.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That's very helpful. Now, Greg, going back to you, when we think about commercial vehicles going forward, we've got a lot of disruption amongst us. We've been talking about, is it fuel cell, is it EV, and mindful of the fact we still have diesel out there, especially in the commercial vehicle market, is very, very important. So, what's your take on sort of that go forward outlook? As we think about this zero emission vehicle transition, are there other factors at play that can contribute to the either displacement or decline of diesel demand or other factors at hand?
Yeah. So I'll take the some of the main points of what we're looking at, maybe to the midterm to long term. Let's say early 2030s, late 2020s. I think a few main points. Globally, I think the decarbonization will be accelerated with ZEVs led by the European Union and the United States, to some extent also in mainland China, because really what we see between now and then is the adoption of these technologies will first be led by the regulatory environment, which is definitely the strongest or most stringent in Europe and the US, and then also total cost of ownership, which Andrej just laid out. And that's going to happen first in mainland China. So we see, let's say the demand drivers a bit different, but those are sort of where the regions we see first. And then when we talk about ZEVs, I touched on it a bit earlier, but I think battery electric, fuel cell electric, and then we also have a hydrogen ICE is expected to carve out a niche in some of these regions. So again, I think we've mentioned a couple of times, but I do think it's a interesting point for the listeners that it's definitely different and a bit, maybe even a bit more complex from the light vehicle market in terms of the propulsion strategies, as I said. And then I do want to mention before shifting to the next question is that with all this being said and all this focus on electrification and zero emission, we do expect the diesel to remain in play a big role in the future, right? In the midterm, the long term. And let's not forget about other solutions such as natural gas or maybe even some sort of hybridization. So we do expect those to play a role as well, just because of the challenges of cost and the challenges of infrastructure and things like that with this segment. We look at these lower emission solutions as also play a role in the midterm.
Definitely.
Yeah, but
Go ahead.
sorry, but I just want to touch quickly on your second question too. That the diesel demand is looking it should decline definitely in the future. I think just beyond ZEVs, because I just think it's important for trucking too. We see a few other pathways to have a little bit lower diesel demand. One, fuel efficiency improvement. We expect the trucks to improve their fuel efficiency with diesel, so that will play a role, and also other things like autonomous trucking and the improvement of the overall logistics efficiency. Not necessarily tailpipe efficiency, but efficiency within the ecosystem, which could lead to lower mileage or even less trucks needed. And then obviously other things like trucking is really tied to the economy, so it depends on what that's going to do, and maybe even some modal shift in freight movement away from trucking. So there's a lot to think about there in terms of diesel demand for sure.
Yeah, great point. A lot of factors at play to be sure.
Yeah.
Andres, we're going to start wrapping up our discussion here. I'd love to have you dust off your crystal ball. You've been in this industry a long time. And not to date you, but I'd really love to get your thoughts. As you start thinking about 2030, 2035, you mentioned earlier going out to 2050, what are some of the key characteristics encompassing the industry in the longer term? What are some of the things folks should be keeping their eye on as they think about that extreme both the long term and the really long term going forward for the commercial vehicle market?
Yeah. So I think looking 2030, 2035, that's obviously a decade out. We think there's still incremental volume growth in the industry. We think markets like India, Brazil, and even to a lesser extent, countries in Europe and North America still have the potential to carry volume higher for the industry. As Greg says, in that time frame, we still do expect the majority of the sold volume, new sales, to remain diesel powered in our baseline. So even out to 2035, we still think that diesel share, medium heavy combined globally, is going to be north of 60%. But by then, because of the mandates and technological progress, we do expect to see significant shares emerging of some of the alternatives. BEVs at that point could be around 20%, and even the share of hydrogen as a propulsion fuel in medium heavy could be crossing the 5% mark. Other things that might happen by then is we should start to get a bit of a sense, obviously, for which of the players in this space are going to make it, which of them aren't. There's a lot in there now. And I think the final one I would say is really the questions around the hydrogen price. That would be something where there's a lot of questions now. People are seeing the potential for that to come down. By that time, we'll be seeing the extent to which that becomes reality.
Yeah, a lot of cross currents again here to be sure. So watch this space. With that, I think we'll end it here. It was a great conversation. I do want to give a big thanks to both Andre and Greg for joining us today. Thanks to everyone for listening. Please share this podcast link with colleagues and in your social media accounts to read the article that accompanies this podcast, as well as to opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others. Please visit spglobal.com/mobility. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. Have a great day.